I was sorting through the last box of Dad's tools when my phone rang. The caller ID showed First National Bank and my stomach dropped. Another bill, probably. Dad had been gone for 3 weeks and the financial cleanup felt endless. Miss Mitchell? This is David Chen from First National. I'm calling about your father's safety deposit box. The annual fee is coming due and I wanted to confirm whether you'd like to maintain the account or close it out. I stopped mid-reach for Dad's rusty hammer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Safety deposit box, I think you have the wrong Robert Mitchell. Box number 247, rented under Robert James Mitchell, 847 Maple Street. That was definitely Dad. But a safety deposit box. In 28 years he'd never mentioned owning one. Dad was the kind of man who kept his important papers in a shoebox under his bed and trusted banks about as much as he trusted politicians. I'll need to come in, I said, my voice barely steady. Of course, just bring identification and the death certificate. We're open until 5. After hanging up, I stared at the cluttered workshop around me. Dad's junk, as Michael called it. Broken radios, half-finished birdhouses, coffee cans full of screws and bolts. Yesterday, my older brother had walked through here with Jennifer, our sister, making jokes about Dad's hoarding habits. They'd already divided up anything they considered valuable, his truck, his tools, even his collection of vintage fishing lures. What remained, they'd decided, would go to Goodwill or the garbage. But a safety deposit box? That suggested Dad had secrets, things he considered important enough to pay monthly fees to protect. The same man who reused aluminum foil and drove a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it had been quietly paying bank fees for years. The workshop felt different now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. Dad had spent every evening out here after Mom died 5 years ago, tinkering with broken electronics and building what the rest of us considered useless contraptions. He'd invite me to help sometimes, and I'd sit on his workbench while he explained the difference between resistors and capacitors, or showed me how to strip wire properly. Those were the moments when he seemed most like himself, when the quiet sadness that had settled over him after Mom's funeral would lift just a little. Michael and Jennifer never understood why I bothered. He's just keeping himself busy, Jennifer would say whenever I mentioned spending time with Dad. It's not like he's actually building anything useful. Michael was even less charitable, calling Dad's workshop a fire hazard, and suggesting we should clean it out while Dad was still alive to see reason. But now, standing among the remnants of Dad's evening projects, I wondered what we'd missed. What had we dismissed as junk that might have meant something more? I grabbed my keys and headed for the bank, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe Dad had been more financially secure than we realized. Maybe there were insurance policies we didn't know about, or important documents that could help settle his estate more easily. The mortgage on the house was nearly paid off, but there were still medical bills from his final months, and none of us kids were exactly wealthy enough to cover everything without strain. First National Bank sat in the middle of Riverside's small downtown, a brick building that had probably looked exactly the same since the 1970s. I'd driven past it thousands of times but never had reason to go inside. Dad had always done his banking at the credit union on the other side of town, the one that cashed his Social Security checks and handled his simple checking account. Mr. Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in his 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He led me through the process with practiced efficiency, checking my identification against his records and making copies of Dad's death certificate. But when we walked into the safety deposit box vault, a windowless room lined with small metal doors, I felt suddenly nervous. "Here we are, Mr. Chen said, stopping in front of box 247. "Your father opened this account in 1998, so he'd been renting it for about 25 years. 25 years. That meant Dad had gotten the box just 3 years after Jennifer was born, when I was still a toddler. Before Mom got sick, before the family dynamics shifted and hardened into the patterns that defined us now." Mr. Chen inserted his master key, then handed me the second key, a small brass thing that had been included with Dad's personal effects. Together, we turned our keys, and the metal door swung open to reveal a long narrow drawer. "I'll give you some privacy," Mr. Chen said, sliding the drawer out and placing it on the table in the center of the room. "Take all the time you need." When the door closed behind him, I found myself alone with whatever Dad had considered important enough to hide away for a quarter century. The drawer was heavier than it looked, filled with manila envelopes, small boxes, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. I opened the journal first. Dad's handwriting, neat and careful in a way that surprised me, his grocery lists had always been nearly illegible. The first entry was dated March 15, 1998. Started the box today. Pat doesn't know, and I don't think she needs to. Some things are for the kids, when they're old enough to understand. Some things are just mine to keep safe. Pat, Dad's second wife, who he'd married when I was 7. She'd moved into our house and immediately begun what she called updating everything. New curtains, new furniture, new rules about noise and mess, and how a proper household should function. She wasn't cruel, exactly, but she had definite ideas about how things should be, and Dad's workshop definitely didn't fit her vision of domestic order. I flipped through more entries. Dad had written sporadically, sometimes going months between entries, but the pattern became clear. This journal was his private space, where he recorded things he couldn't say out loud. Frustration.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
With Pat's attempts to change their home. Worries about Michael's drinking in high school. Pride in Jennifer's academic achievements. Concerns about my tendency to drift through jobs without finding real direction. But it was the entries from the last few years that made my hands shake. Michael came by today asking about the will again. He's worried Pat will inherit everything, but he doesn't understand that's not what worries me. It's what they'll throw away. 25 years of building something, and they see it as junk to be hauled to the curb. Sarah's the only one who ever asked questions, who wanted to learn. But even she doesn't know what's really here. What's really here? I set the journal aside and reached for the manila envelopes. The first one contained patents, official government documents, with Dad's name listed as the inventor. Patent for an improved, solar panel efficiency maximizer. Patent for a low-cost water filtration system. Patent for something called a modular emergency communication device. I stared at the papers, trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't just Dad's evening hobbies. These were legitimate inventions, registered with the U.S. Patent Office, some dating back 15 years or more. The solar panel device alone had been licensed to 3 different companies, according to the licensing agreements in the next envelope. And then I found the bank statements. Not from Dad's regular credit union account, but from a business account I'd never heard of. Mitchell Innovations LLC. Monthly deposits ranging from $1,500 to $8,000, going back years. Royalty payments from his patents, consulting fees, licensing agreements. The final balance, from just 2 months before Dad died, showed over $400,000. $400,000. While we'd been worrying about medical bills and mortgage payments, Dad had been quietly accumulating enough money to solve every financial problem our family had ever had. Money he'd earned not from investments or inheritance, but from building things in his cluttered workshop. The same workshop Michael and Jennifer had mocked as a collection of useless junk. But why hadn't he told us? Why keep this secret, even from Mom before she died? I found part of the answer in another journal entry, this one from 2019. Mentioned the solar project to Michael today, thinking he might be interested in the business side. He laughed and said I should stick to fixing radios and leave the real work to people who understand technology. Jennifer was even worse when I tried to show her the water filter prototype last month. Dad, you're not an engineer, she said. You barely finished high school. Pat just rolled her eyes when I mentioned applying for another patent. More paperwork to clutter up the house, she said. Only Sarah ever asks how things work, ever sits and listens when I explain the science. But she's got her own life to build. Can't burden her with an old man's dreams. I had to stop reading. The hurt in Dad's words was too raw, too familiar. I remembered those conversations differently. I'd thought Dad was just sharing his hobbies, passing time with projects that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. I never realized he was trying to share something bigger, something he'd built from nothing into a legitimate business. The last envelope contained something that made everything else fade into background noise. A will dated just 6 months ago, completely different from the simple document Pat had produced after the funeral. This will established a trust, with specific instructions for how Dad's assets should be distributed. The house would go to Pat, as expected, but the patents, the business accounts, and all the intellectual property rights would be split equally between his 3 children, with one crucial caveat. My children Michael, Jennifer and Sarah shall inherit all rights and assets associated with Mitchell Innovations LLC, provided they demonstrate understanding and respect for the work that created these assets. Should any heir refer to this work as junk or otherwise dismiss its value before learning its true nature, their inheritance shall be forfeited and redistributed to the remaining heirs who show proper appreciation for innovation and creativity. Dad had known exactly what would happen. He'd heard his own children mock his life's work often enough to predict their reaction after his death. This wasn't just a will, it was a test, designed to protect his legacy from people who couldn't see its value. But there was more. A letter sealed in a separate envelope, with my name written across it in Dad's careful handwriting. Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you were curious enough to follow the trail I left. You were always the one who asked questions, who wanted to understand how things worked instead of just whether they worked. That's the mind of an inventor, sweetheart, even if you never thought of yourself that way. Everything in this box belongs to you now, not because you're my favorite, but because you're the only one who ever saw potential where others saw problems. The patents, the business, the money, it's all yours to do with as you see fit. Your brother and sister made their choice every time they called my work junk. I hope someday they understand what they threw away, but that's not your responsibility to fix. Build something beautiful with what I'm leaving you. Build something that matters. And remember that every invention starts with someone willing to see possibility in the broken pieces everyone else wants to throw away. I love you, kiddo. Make me proud. I sat in that windowless bank vault and cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. Not the polite, quiet tears I'd shed during the service, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. Dad had spent 25 years building something remarkable, and we'd been too blind to see it. Worse, we'd made him feel like his dreams were foolish, his work worthless. But he'd found a way to protect what mattered most, even from his own family's ignorance. When I finally composed myself enough to leave the bank, my phone was buzzing with messages. 3 texts from Michael, asking if I wanted to help load Dad's junk into the truck for tomorrow's trip to Goodwill. 2 voicemails from Jennifer, wondering if I'd found anything valuable while cleaning out the workshop. A text from Pat, reminding me that she needed the garage cleared by the weekend so she could park both cars inside now that winter was coming. They had no idea what they were about to throw away. Dad's prototypes, his research notes, his half-finished inventions, everything they saw as clutter was actually the physical foundation of a $400,000 business. The water filtration system alone had potential applications that could help thousands of people. The solar efficiency device was years ahead of current market alternatives. And they wanted to donate it all to Goodwill, because it looked like junk. I sat in my car outside the bank, staring at Dad's house across town where I knew Michael and Jennifer were probably making more jokes about his hoarding habits while they sorted through the remnants of his life's work. They had no idea that the broken radio, they'd probably already marked for donation, was actually a prototype emergency communication device that could revolutionize disaster response systems. Part of me wanted to drive straight over there and confront them with everything I'd learned. To wave the patents in their faces, and demand they apologize for every dismissive comment they'd ever made about Dad's intelligence, his education, his worth as an inventor and innovator. But Dad's letter had been clear. This wasn't about punishing Michael and Jennifer for their short-sightedness. It was about protecting something valuable from being destroyed by people who couldn't recognize its worth. Tomorrow they would load up Dad's inventions and drive them to Goodwill, never knowing they were throwing away prototypes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They would feel good about themselves for cleaning up Dad's mess and getting Pat's garage organized. And I would let them. Because Dad had been right about one thing: you can't force people to see potential where they've already decided only problems exist. Michael and Jennifer had made their choice years ago. Every time they rolled their eyes at Dad's projects, or suggested he find a normal hobby, they'd chosen to see junk where Dad saw possibility. But I had made a different choice. Every time I'd sat on Dad's workbench and asked how something worked, every time I'd handed him tools and listened to his explanations, I'd been choosing to see what he saw. I just hadn't realized how much it meant to him, or how much he'd been building while I watched. Now I had a choice to make. Dad had left me not just money and patents, but responsibility. The responsibility to decide what happened next, how his innovations would reach the world, whether his years of quiet brilliance would matter beyond the walls of his cluttered workshop. I looked at the bank documents spread across my passenger seat, then at Dad's house in the distance where my siblings were probably boxing up his legacy to give away. Tomorrow would be interesting, but tonight I had patents to read and prototypes to understand. Dad had spent 25 years building something remarkable in secret. Now it was my turn to build something beautiful from the pieces he'd left behind. The only question was whether I'd have the courage to do it right. I drove home in a daze, the weight of Dad's secrets pressing down on me like a physical force. $400,000. Patents worth potentially millions. A business I'd never heard of, built from inventions I'd watched him create in what everyone else called his junk pile. The leather portfolio, containing all the documents, sat on my passenger seat like a bomb waiting to explode my family's understanding of who Robert Mitchell really was. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Jennifer's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. How could I possibly explain what I'd just discovered? How could I tell her that while she'd been dismissing Dad as a lonely widower playing with broken electronics, he'd been building a legitimate technology business? "Hey Jen," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. Michael and I have been going through more of Dad's stuff, and honestly, I don't know how he lived in that chaos. We found 3 more boxes of broken circuit boards in the basement, and there's this whole shelf of notebooks filled with diagrams that don't make any sense. It's like he was trying to reinvent the wheel over and over again. Circuit boards. Diagrams. My stomach clenched as I realized what they were describing. Dad's research and development materials, the physical foundation of his patent applications. To Jennifer they looked like the obsessive scribblings of a man who had too much time on his hands. She had no idea she was looking at years of careful engineering work. "What are you planning to do with all of it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, that's why I'm calling. Pat wants everything cleared out by Saturday, so she can turn the basement into a proper storage area. Michael thinks we should just rent a dumpster and be done with it, but I thought maybe you'd want to go through things first. You always seem to understand Dad's projects better than we did." Understand? If only she knew how much I was just beginning to understand. "I'll come over tomorrow morning," I said. "Don't throw anything away until I get there, okay?"
Oh!
Though honestly, Sarah, I don't think there's anything valuable down there. Just boxes and boxes of electronic parts and those weird notebooks. You know how Dad was after Mom died. He needed projects to keep busy, even if they weren't practical. After hanging up, I sat in my car staring at my own front door, unable to process the disconnect between what Jennifer saw and what I now knew to be true. Dad hadn't been keeping busy with meaningless projects. He'd been methodically developing and patenting innovations that were now generating substantial passive income. The weird notebooks were likely his research journals, documenting years of careful experimentation and refinement. But Jennifer couldn't see it, none of them could. They'd already decided that Dad's intelligence peaked with his high school diploma, that his lack of formal engineering education meant his work couldn't be sophisticated or valuable. They'd spent so many years viewing his projects through the lens of polite tolerance that they'd become blind to the possibility that he might actually know what he was doing. I finally went inside and spread Dad's documents across my kitchen table. The patent applications alone were staggering in their complexity and foresight. The solar panel efficiency maximizer addressed problems in renewable energy that I'd seen discussed in recent tech articles, but Dad's solution predated those discussions by years. His water filtration system used principles I barely understood, but the licensing agreements showed it was being manufactured by 3 different companies for use in developing countries. The emergency communication device was perhaps the most impressive. Reading through the technical specifications, I realized Dad had essentially invented a way for communities to maintain communication networks during natural disasters when traditional infrastructure failed. The device could be built using common electronic components and powered by multiple sources, including solar, hand crank, or even salvaged car batteries. It was brilliant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its potential impact. And tomorrow, if I didn't intervene, the prototypes for all of these inventions would be loaded into a truck and donated to Goodwill. I spent the evening researching Dad's patents online, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd accomplished. The deeper I dug, the more amazed I became. This wasn't just a hobbyist tinkering in his garage. This was a legitimate inventor who'd identified real problems and developed elegant solutions. The fact that he'd done it all while working his regular job at the hardware store, while caring for Mom during her illness, while maintaining the facade of being just another retiree with too much time on his hands, made it even more remarkable. But it also made it heartbreaking. Dad had carried this secret for 25 years, unable to share his successes with the people who should have been proudest of him. Every time Michael had rolled his eyes at another broken radio project, every time Jennifer had suggested Dad find a normal hobby, every time Pat had complained about the clutter in his workshop, they'd been unknowingly dismissing work that was generating more income than any of their own careers. The journal entries became harder to read as the evening wore on. Dad's excitement about breakthrough moments, tempered by his inability to share them with anyone. His frustration when family members treated his explanations as the ramblings of an old man with nothing better to do. His growing isolation as he realized that the people closest to him couldn't see the value in what mattered most to him. One entry from 2 years ago was particularly painful. Sarah asked good questions about the water filter today. Real questions, not just polite interest. For a minute I thought about showing her the patent papers, explaining how the licensing works, maybe even bringing her into the business side of things. But then Jennifer called, and I heard Sarah explaining to her that she was helping Dad with his projects in that same tone people use when they talk about humoring elderly relatives. Even Sarah sees this as charity work, spending time with the eccentric old man and his broken gadgets. Maybe it's better that way, at least she asks questions. I had to set the journal down. Dad had been right, even I had seen our time together as a form of gentle caretaking rather than legitimate collaboration. I'd asked questions because I cared about him, not because I recognized the sophistication of what he was showing me. I'd been condescending without even realizing it, treating his expertise as endearing rather than respectable. But he'd forgiven me for that blindness in a way he couldn't forgive the others. His letter had been clear. He'd seen potential in my curiosity, even when I couldn't see it myself. He'd believed I could learn to value innovation over appearances, substance over conventional success markers. The question was whether he'd been right. Part 3. The denial phase. The next morning, I drove to Dad's house with a plan forming in my mind. I wouldn't tell Michael and Jennifer about the patents yet, they'd never believe me anyway, and the shock might make them defensive rather than receptive. Instead, I'd try to help them see what Dad had really been doing, guide them toward understanding the sophistication of his work, before revealing the financial success it had generated. Maybe if they could appreciate the ingenuity first, they'd be more open to learning about the business success that followed. Michael's truck was already in the driveway when I arrived, along with Jennifer's SUV and Pat's sedan. Through the open garage door, I could see them moving systematically through Dad's workshop, sorting items into boxes labeled Keep, Donate, and Trash. The Keep box was notably small. "Sarah, perfect timing," Michael called out as I approached. "We were just trying to figure out what to do with all these." He gestured toward a table covered with Dad's circuit boards and electronic components. "I mean, some of this stuff might be worth something to the right person, but honestly, it just looks like junk to me." I picked up one of the circuit boards, recognizing it from the patent diagrams I'd studied the night before. It was a prototype for the emergency communication device, hand-soldered with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what each component contributed to the overall function. To Michael, it probably looked like random electronics parts glued together by an amateur. "Did Dad ever explain what this was for?" I asked, holding up the board. "Oh, you know Dad," Jennifer said from across the room, where she was boxing up tools. "He always had some elaborate story about how his gadgets were going to change the world. This one was supposed to be some kind of radio that could work during emergencies or something. But look at it, it's obviously just pieces of old electronics stuck together. It's not like he was actually an engineer. Not like he was actually an engineer." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. The device in my hands represented years of research and development, sophisticated understanding of signal processing and power management, elegant solutions to complex technical problems. And Jennifer dismissed it as random junk because Dad hadn't had the right degree hanging on his wall. "Maybe we should test it," I suggested. "See if it actually works before we decide it's worthless." Pat looked up from the corner where she was sorting through Dad's notebooks. "Sarah, honey, I know you want to honor your father's memory, but we can't keep every broken radio he ever tinkered with. There's just too much stuff, and most of it genuinely doesn't work. How do you know it doesn't work? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Well, Pat paused, clearly taken aback by my tone. I mean, look around. If any of this stuff actually worked, don't you think Bob would have done something with it? Sold it, or used it, or at least mentioned that it was functional. The irony was staggering. Dad had done something with it. He'd patented it, licensed it, and built a business around it. But because he'd kept that success secret, his own family assumed his work was worthless. They'd created a narrative where Dad was a harmless eccentric playing with broken electronics, and now that narrative was so entrenched they couldn't see evidence that contradicted it. I spent the next hour trying to demonstrate the sophistication of Dad's work. I explained the theory behind the solar efficiency maximizer, showed them the careful documentation in his notebooks, pointed out the precision of his component selection and circuit design. But every explanation was met with the same patient tolerance they'd probably shown Dad himself, polite attention followed by gentle dismissal. Sarah, I can see this means a lot to you. Michael finally said, but we need to be realistic. Dad was a smart guy, but he wasn't a professional inventor. This is all just hobby-level stuff. Maybe some of it works, maybe it doesn't, but either way it's not something any of us are qualified to maintain or understand. What if I told you some of this hobby-level stuff was actually patented? I asked. Jennifer laughed. Patents? Sarah, you can't just decide to patent something because you built it in your garage. There's a whole process, engineering reviews, technical documentation. Dad never mentioned anything about patents. Maybe because you never asked, I said quietly. The room went silent. I could see I'd crossed a line, moved from gentle advocacy into direct criticism. But I was tired of watching them dismiss Dad's intelligence based on assumptions
about what someone with his background could or couldn't accomplish. Michael set down the box he'd been packing and turned to face me fully. Okay, Sarah, I can see you're upset, and I understand why. We all love Dad, and it's natural to want his projects to be more significant than they probably were. But getting emotional about it isn't going to change the facts. What facts? I asked. What facts are you basing this on? Other than your assumption that Dad wasn't smart enough to do real engineering work. That's not fair, Jennifer said. We're not saying Dad wasn't smart, we're saying he wasn't trained. There's a difference between being intelligent and being qualified to design functional technology. So if I showed you documentation proving that Dad's designs actually work, proving they solve real problems and have commercial value, you'd change your mind. The three of them exchanged glances. I could see them wondering if I'd lost perspective, if grief was making me attach unrealistic significance to Dad's hobbies. Sarah, Pat said gently, if your father had really invented something valuable, don't you think he would have told us? Don't you think there would be some record of it, some indication that his work was more than just a way to keep busy? They were asking exactly the right questions, making exactly the logical assumptions that Dad had known they'd make. He'd understood his own family well enough to predict this conversation, to know that even evidence of his success wouldn't immediately convince people who'd spent years seeing him as a well-meaning amateur. But he'd also understood that I was different. Not because I was smarter or more perceptive, but because I was willing to ask questions instead of making assumptions. Because I could imagine the possibility that there was more to Dad's work than met the eye. There is a record, I said finally. There's documentation of everything, the patents, the licensing agreements, the commercial applications. Dad kept records of all of it. Michael's expression shifted from patient tolerance to concern. Sarah, what are you talking about? What records? I could see the moment when they started to wonder if I was having some kind of breakdown, if the stress of Dad's death was making me create fantasies about his secret life as a successful inventor. The idea that their narrative about Dad might be wrong was apparently less believable than the possibility that I was losing my grip on reality. I'm talking about Dad's safety deposit box, I said. The one he rented for 25 years to store documentation of his patent applications and business activities. The silence that followed was different from before. Less patient, more wary. I could see them trying to process what I'd said, weighing it against everything they thought they knew about Dad's capabilities and circumstances. Dad didn't have a safety deposit box, Jennifer said finally. He did all his banking at the credit union. He didn't trust big banks, remember? He had accounts at both places, I said. The credit union for his regular expenses, First National for his business activities. Business activities, Michael's voice had an edge now. Sarah, what exactly are you claiming here? I looked around the workshop one more time, at the prototypes they'd been about to throw away.
At the notebooks full of research they'd dismissed as meaningless scribbles. At the careful organization of components they'd seen only as clutter. Everything that proved Dad's expertise was right here in front of them, but they couldn't see it because they'd already decided what it meant. I'm claiming that Dad was exactly what he appeared to be, I said. An inventor who built functional devices that solve real problems. The only difference is that instead of keeping his work as a hobby, he turned it into a legitimate business. And instead of bragging about his success, he kept it private because he knew you wouldn't believe him anyway. Part 4. The harsh acceptance. The three of them stared at me like I'd just announced that Dad had been secretly working for NASA. The disbelief on their faces was so complete, so automatic, that I realized how deeply their assumptions about Dad were rooted. This wasn't just skepticism, it was a fundamental inability to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the evidence I was presenting. Sarah, Jennifer said carefully, using the same tone she'd probably use with a confused child, I think maybe you're reading too much into whatever you found at the bank. Dad was a wonderful man, but he wasn't a business owner or a professional inventor. He worked at Murphy's Hardware for 30 years and retired on Social Security. That's not the profile of someone who builds million-dollar companies. Million-dollar companies. Michael's eyebrows shot up. Now it's million-dollar companies. Sarah, listen to yourself. Yesterday you were helping us sort through Dad's junk, and now you're claiming he was some kind of secret technology mogul. That's not grief talking, that's fantasy. Pat had been quiet during this exchange, but now she moved closer to the table where Dad's prototypes were laid out. She picked up one of the devices, the water filtration system, though she had no way of knowing what it was, and turned it over in her hands. This looks like something Bob threw together from spare parts, she said. The soldering is uneven, some of these connections look loose, and I can see where he used electrical tape to hold pieces together. I'm not trying to diminish your father's memory, Sarah, but this doesn't look like professional-grade equipment. I wanted to explain that the uneven soldering was actually Dad's way of accommodating thermal expansion, that the loose connections were designed to be easily replaceable in field conditions, that the electrical tape was a temporary measure from when he was still testing different configurations. But I could see it would be pointless. They'd already decided that anything Dad built had to look amateur, because Dad himself was an amateur in their minds. The patents are public record, I said, instead. You can look them up online. Robert James Mitchell, multiple patents filed between 2005 and 2023, all of them related to the devices you're looking at right now. Patents can be filed by anyone, Michael said dismissively. That doesn't mean they're valuable, or that anyone actually uses them. People patent crazy ideas all the time. These patents are licensed, I said. They're generating royalty income. Dad's been earning money from them for years. How much money? Jennifer asked, and I could hear the skepticism in her voice. She was probably expecting me to claim a few $100s a year, maybe enough to cover the cost of filing the patents in the first place. Last year alone, about $60,000 in royalties. The number hit them like a physical blow. Michael actually took a step backward, Jennifer's mouth fell open, and Pat nearly dropped the device she was holding. 60,000, Jennifer repeated. Sarah, that's impossible. We would have known. There would have been tax records, bank statements, something. There are tax records, I said. And bank statements. Just not from the accounts you knew about. Michael shook his head violently. No, this is insane. Dad lived in the same house for 40 years, drove the same truck for 15 years, shopped with coupons and fixed his own appliances. You're telling me he was secretly earning more money than most people make at their regular jobs, and he just, hid it all away? Why would he hide it? Pat demanded. If Bob was really making that kind of money, why wouldn't he tell me? Why wouldn't he use it to make our lives easier, fix up the house, maybe take a vacation? It doesn't make sense. But it did make sense, in a heartbreaking way that I was only beginning to understand. Dad had tried to share his work with them, tried to explain what he was building, and why it mattered. But every attempt had been met with polite dismissal or outright mockery. Eventually he'd stopped trying. He'd kept his success secret because he'd learned that the people closest to him couldn't see value in work that didn't come with traditional credentials. Maybe he did try to tell you, I said quietly. Maybe every time he tried to explain his projects, every time he showed you something he'd built, he was trying to share what was really important to him. But you'd already decided it was just junk. That's not fair, Jennifer said. But her voice lacked conviction. When was the last time any of you actually listened when Dad tried to explain how something worked? When was the last time you asked a serious question about his projects instead of just nodding politely and changing the subject? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. I could see them thinking back through years of interactions with Dad, remembering moments when he tried to engage them in conversations about his work, and they'd responded with the benevolent patience you'd show a child playing with toys. Michael was the first to break. Even if that's true, he said, even if Dad really was earning money from his inventions, it doesn't change anything. We still need to clean out this workshop. We still need to decide what to do with all this stuff. All this stuff includes the prototypes for devices that are currently generating income. I said, you're talking about throwing away the physical foundation of a business that's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Hundreds of thousands. Pat's voice cracked on the words. I reached into my bag and pulled out the bank statements I'd copied at First National. Mitchell Innovations LLC. Current balance, $412,637. All of it earned from licensing Dad's patents and consulting on implementation of his designs. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't skepticism or disbelief. This was shock, the kind that comes when reality shifts so dramatically that you can't immediately adjust to the new landscape. I watched the three of them struggle to process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about Dad's life and capabilities. Jennifer was the first to recover. Show me, she said, reaching for the bank statements. If this is real, if Dad really built some kind of business empire in his workshop, then show me the proof. I handed over the papers, watching as she scanned the monthly deposits, the balance history, the business registration documents. Her expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something approaching awe. These deposits, she said slowly. They're consistent. Month after month, year after year. This isn't just a few lucky breaks. This is sustained income from multiple sources. Michael looked over her shoulder, reading the statements with the same expression he might wear while watching a magic trick he couldn't figure out. But how? I mean, even if Dad's inventions work, how does someone with no business training, no marketing background, no connections in the tech industry, build this kind of operation? The same way he built the inventions, I said. Carefully, methodically, by solving problems and finding people who needed solutions. Dad didn't need an MBA to recognize that clean water and reliable communication are valuable commodities. He just needed to build devices that delivered those things better than existing alternatives. Pat had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. The workshop, she said. All those nights when Bob was out there working, all those weekends when he said he was just tinkering around. He was actually running a business. He was actually building the future, I corrected. The business was just what happened when people realized how valuable his solutions were. The three of them stood in Dad's workshop, surrounded by evidence of his expertise that they'd been about to donate to charity, trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality of what he'd accomplished. I could see the realization dawning, that they'd spent years dismissing work that was not only sophisticated but financially successful. But I could also see something else in their expressions, the beginning of calculation. The shift from shock at Dad's secret success, to questions about what that success meant for them. The will, Michael said suddenly. Dad's will doesn't mention any of this. It just leaves the house to Pat, and splits his regular savings account between the three of us. What happens to the business? And there it was. The moment when Dad's test would begin in earnest. The moment when I'd find out whether Michael and Jennifer could learn to see value in Dad's work, or whether they'd remain focused on what that work could do for them financially. That's complicated, I said carefully. There's more than one will. Part 5. The root cause revealed. His punch will changed everything, and nothing. As I explained Dad's careful legal maneuvering, the trust he'd established, the conditions he'd attached to inheritance of his business assets, I watched my siblings' faces cycle through a predictable range of emotions. Shock gave way to anger, anger gave way to calculation, and calculation gave way to something that looked suspiciously like panic. So let me get this straight, Michael said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Dad set up some kind of test, where we only inherit his business if we prove we respect his work. And if we fail the test, everything goes to whoever passes. That's oversimplifying it, but essentially yes. And the test is what exactly? We have to pretend that his garage projects were actually sophisticated technology. I could hear the trap in his question, The assumption that respecting Dad's work meant lying about its value. Michael still couldn't conceive that the work itself might actually be valuable. He could only imagine that Dad had somehow tricked people into paying for worthless inventions. The test is whether you can recognize value when you see it, I said. Whether you can look at Dad's inventions and understand what they actually accomplish instead of dismissing them as junk, because they don't look like what you expect professional technology to look like. Jennifer had been quiet, but now she spoke up. This is emotional blackmail, she said. Dad knew we'd react exactly the way we did react, and he used that knowledge to manipulate us. He set us up to fail so he could justify giving everything to his favorite daughter. The accusation stung because part of it was true. Dad had known exactly how they'd react. He'd lived with their dismissive attitudes for years. But Jennifer's interpretation missed the crucial point. Dad hadn't wanted them to fail. He'd hoped they might surprise him, might finally see what he'd been trying to show them all along. Read the journal entries, I said, pulling out Dad's leather-bound notebook. Read what he wrote about trying to share his work with you, about hoping you'd show interest in what he was building. This wasn't a setup, it was a final chance for you to see him clearly. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was being naive. Dad had been smart enough to build a successful business while working full-time and caring for a sick wife. He'd been strategic enough to protect his patents and navigate complex licensing agreements. Had he really believed Michael and Jennifer would suddenly develop appreciation for work they'd been mocking for years? Or had he known exactly what would happen, and designed his will accordingly? Pat had been going through the financial documents while we argued, and now she looked up with a strange expression. The dates, she said. Bob started this business account in 1998, 3 years after we got married. He was already working on patents before I moved into the house. So? Michael asked. So he never told me about any of it. 27 years of marriage, and he kept this completely secret. Every month money was flowing into accounts I didn't know existed, from work I didn't know he was doing. Her voice cracked slightly. How could he not trust me enough to share something this important? The question hung in the air like an accusation, but I could see the real pain behind it. Pat hadn't just discovered that Dad was successful, she'd discovered that he'd hidden that success from her. For nearly 3 decades, he'd maintained a double life, presenting himself as a retired hardware store employee, while secretly operating as a technology entrepreneur. Maybe it wasn't about trust, I said carefully. Maybe it was about protecting something precious from people who couldn't understand its value. I would have understood, Pat said. But her voice lacked conviction. If Bob had explained what he was really doing, if he'd shown me the patents and the licensing agreements, I would have supported him. Would you? I asked. Because I remember you complaining about the clutter in his workshop, about the noise from his soldering iron, about the way electronic components were always scattered across the kitchen table. Would you really have been supportive if you'd known he was building a business? Or would you have worried about liability and insurance, and whether the neighbors might complain about commercial activity in a residential zone? Pat opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She was probably remembering all the times she'd asked Dad to clean up after himself, or suggested he find a quieter hobby. All the ways she'd subtly discouraged the very work that was generating substantial income. Jennifer had been reading through Dad's journal while we talked, and now she looked up with tears in her eyes. Listen to this, she said, and began reading aloud from an entry dated 3 years ago. Jennifer stopped by today to show me pictures from her promotion ceremony. She looked so proud in her new office, talking about her responsibilities as regional sales manager. I wanted to tell her about the licensing deal I just signed, about how the water filtration system is now being manufactured for disaster relief operations. I wanted to share that I'm proud of my accomplishments too. But when I started to mention the patent approval, she interrupted to ask if I'd been taking my blood pressure medication. She sees me as an old man who needs looking after, not as someone who might have achievements worth celebrating. The entry continued, but Jennifer's voice broke, and she couldn't finish reading. I could see the recognition dawning in her face, the understanding that she'd participated in Dad's isolation without even realizing it. He tried to tell us, she whispered. All those times when he wanted to explain his projects, when he got excited about some breakthrough or approval. We thought he was just rambling, just an old man trying to feel important. He was important, I said. His work is helping people access clean water in places where traditional infrastructure doesn't exist. His communication devices are being used by emergency response teams. His solar efficiency improvements are making renewable energy more viable in developing countries. Dad wasn't just building gadgets. He was solving real problems for real people. Michael had been quiet during this exchange, but now he exploded. Fine. So Dad was a secret genius inventor who built a technology empire, while we all thought he was just fixing broken radios. That doesn't change the fact that he manipulated us with this ridiculous will condition. He knew we'd call his work junk, because we'd been calling it junk for years, and he used that knowledge to justify cutting us out of his estate. Nobody's been cut out, I said. The condition isn't that you have to have appreciated Dad's work from the beginning. It's that you have to be capable of appreciating it now, when you understand what it really represents. And what if we can't? Michael demanded. What if we look at these prototypes and still see amateur electronics projects? What if we read the patents and still think Dad got lucky with some bureaucratic oversight? What if we just fundamentally disagree with your assessment of his capabilities? The question cut to the heart of Dad's test. It wasn't really about technical knowledge or business acumen. It was about the capacity to revise your assumptions when presented with contradictory evidence. Dad had spent years watching his family dismiss his intelligence and capabilities. His final gift to them was an opportunity to demonstrate growth, to show they could learn from being wrong. But growth requires humility, and humility was never Michael's strongest characteristic. Then you'll forfeit your inheritance, I said simply. And Dad will have been right about your inability to see value in work that doesn't come with conventional credentials. Jesus, Sarah, listen to yourself, Michael said. You're talking about Dad like he was some kind of misunderstood genius. But 3 days ago, you were helping us sort through his junk, just like the rest of us. What makes you so special? What makes you the only one capable of recognizing his true worth? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since leaving the bank. What had made Dad believe I was different from Michael and Jennifer? What had he seen in my curious questions that he didn't see in their polite tolerance? Maybe nothing, I admitted. Maybe I'm just as blind as you are, and Dad was wrong to trust me with his legacy. But there's one crucial difference between us right now, which is I'm willing to be wrong about what I thought I knew. I'm willing to look at evidence that contradicts my assumptions and revise my understanding accordingly. The question is whether you can do the same. The workshop fell silent, except for the sound of Pat quietly crying as she continued reading through Dad's journal. Michael and Jennifer stood surrounded by devices they'd been about to throw away, devices that now represented a business empire they'd never imagined their father was capable of building. But I could see in their faces that they still couldn't quite believe it. The evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was genuine. The financial records were clear. But accepting Dad's success meant accepting that they'd been fundamentally wrong about his intelligence, his capabilities, his worth as an innovator. It meant accepting that they'd spent years condescending to a man who was quietly changing the world from his cluttered workshop. And for some people, being wrong is harder to accept than missing out on an inheritance. I left Dad's house that afternoon, feeling like I'd detonated a bomb in the middle of my family's understanding of reality. Michael had stormed out after declaring the whole situation manipulative nonsense. Jennifer had gone home to process everything. And Pat had locked herself in the bedroom with Dad's journal, emerging only to ask if I could postpone the Goodwill pickup until she'd had time to think things through. The workshop looked different now that I knew what I was seeing. Instead of an elderly man's cluttered hobby space, it appeared as what it actually was: the research and development laboratory of a successful technology entrepreneur. Every prototype told a story of careful iteration and refinement. Every notebook contained documentation that would be valuable to engineers trying to understand Dad's methodologies. Every component had been selected for specific technical reasons that reflected deep understanding of materials science and electrical engineering. But I was probably the only person who would ever see it that way. My phone started ringing before I'd even made it home. Jennifer called first, her voice strained and uncertain. Sarah, I've been thinking about everything you showed us today, and I need to ask you something directly. Do you really believe Dad was some kind of engineering genius, or are you just trying to make sense of information that doesn't quite add up? The question revealed the depth of Jennifer's struggle to reconcile new information with old assumptions. She could accept that Dad had somehow generated income from his projects, but the idea that he'd done so through legitimate technical innovation was still beyond her ability to process. What would it take to convince you? I asked instead of answering directly. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe if I could see the devices actually working. Maybe if I could understand how they solve the problems you say they solve. Right now it just feels like everyone was wrong about Dad for 25 years, and that seems impossible. Why does it seem impossible? Because we lived with him, Sarah. We saw him every day.
If he was really building sophisticated technology, if he was really running a successful business, there would have been signs, phone calls with clients, business meetings, technical conferences, something that indicated his work was more than just a retirement hobby. Jennifer's logic was sound, but it missed the crucial element of Dad's personality. He'd been a private man, even before his family's dismissive attitude drove him further into secrecy. The idea of drawing attention to his successes, of risking criticism or disbelief, would have been deeply uncomfortable for him. Better to work quietly and let the results speak for themselves, even if the only people listening were licensing partners and patent attorneys who'd never met his family. Maybe the signs were there, I suggested. Maybe we just didn't recognize them as signs because we weren't looking for evidence of success. What do you mean? Remember how Dad always seemed to know exactly which electronic components to order for his projects? How he never had to return things, or make multiple trips to the electronics store? Remember how he could troubleshoot any device in the house? How he always knew what was wrong and how to fix it? Those weren't the skills of an amateur hobbyist. Those were the skills of someone with deep technical expertise. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. But lots of people are good at fixing things, she said finally. That doesn't make them professional inventors. You're right, I agreed. But professional inventors are usually good at fixing things. The question is whether we dismissed Dad's technical skills because we assumed someone with his background couldn't possibly be operating at a professional level. After Jennifer hung up, Michael called. His conversation was shorter and more direct. I've been doing some research, he said without preamble. I looked up Dad's patents online, and they're real. The licensing agreements are real. The business registration is real. I can't argue with the documentation. But, I could hear the reservation in his voice. But I still think this whole inheritance condition is manipulative bullshit. Even if Dad was legitimately successful, even if we were wrong about his capabilities, setting up a test that he knew we'd fail is vindictive. He could have just told us the truth while he was alive, instead of creating this elaborate gotcha moment after his death. Michael's anger made sense from his perspective. He'd discovered that his understanding of Dad was fundamentally flawed. But instead of focusing on the implications of that discovery, he was focusing on feeling manipulated. It was easier to be angry about Dad's secrecy than to grapple with the possibility that he'd spent years being casually dismissive towards someone whose work deserved respect. Maybe he tried to tell us the truth, I said. Maybe we just weren't ready to hear. Come on, Sarah. If Dad had said, hey, I'm earning $60,000 a year from patents on devices I built in my workshop, we would have listened. We would have asked questions. We would have been interested. Would we? Or would we have assumed he was exaggerating?
Seriously? Or would we have humored him the same way we humored his explanations of how his projects worked? Michael didn't answer directly, but I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. This whole situation is fucked up, he said finally. I don't know what to believe anymore. Pat's call came later that evening, after I'd spent hours trying to process the day's revelations myself. I've been reading Bob's journal, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. Entry after entry about wanting to share his successes with family, about feeling isolated and misunderstood. But Sarah, I was his wife. If he felt that isolated, if he needed that kind of support, why didn't he just talk to me directly? It was the same question Jennifer had asked about Dad's technical skills. Why hadn't there been more obvious signs? But Pat's version carried additional weight because she'd shared Dad's daily life in ways the rest of us hadn't. If anyone should have known about his secret business activities, it should have been his wife. What would you have done? I asked carefully. If Dad had told you 5 years ago that he was earning substantial income from inventions he'd built in his workshop, I would have been proud of him, Pat said immediately. I would have wanted to understand his work better, maybe help with the business side of things. I ran the books for my father's construction company for 10 years. I understand small business operations. But would you have believed him initially, if he'd just announced one day that his hobby projects were actually generating professional-level income? Would your first reaction have been pride and interest, or concern that he might be getting scammed or developing unrealistic expectations? Pat was quiet for a long time. I don't know, she admitted finally. Maybe both. I mean, Bob was brilliant at fixing things, but the idea that he could build devices sophisticated enough to compete with professional engineers, it would have been hard to accept without seeing proof. And if he'd sensed that skepticism, if he'd felt like he needed to prove his credibility before you'd take him seriously, what do you think he would have done? He would have. Pat's voice trailed off as the implication became clear. He would have waited until he had overwhelming evidence. He would have built the business first and revealed it later, when no one could question whether it was real. Which is exactly what he did. The problem is that later never came because he died before he felt confident that we'd understand what he'd accomplished. But why didn't he feel confident? Pat asked. What did we do that made him think we wouldn't support his success? It was the question that had been haunting me since reading Dad's journal entries. Not just what we'd done, but what we'd failed to do. All the times we'd changed the subject when he tried to explain his projects. All the times we'd treated his technical expertise as cute rather than impressive. All the ways we'd subtly communicated that his work wasn't important enough to warrant serious attention. I think it was cumulative, I said. Not any single conversation, but the overall pattern of how we responded to his interests. We were polite but not engaged. We were tolerant but not curious. And eventually he stopped trying to engage us because he'd learned that we couldn't see the value in what mattered most to him. Pat made a sound that might have been a sob. 27 years of marriage, and I never really understood what my husband was doing with his time. I thought I was being supportive by letting him have his workshop space and not complaining too much about the clutter. But what he needed was someone who could appreciate the sophistication of his work. Maybe, I said, or maybe what he needed was just someone who would ask genuine questions instead of making assumptions about the complexity of his projects. Could you? Pat asked suddenly. Could you appreciate the sophistication of his work? Or are you just better at pretending? It was a fair question. I'd spent the past 24 hours positioning myself as the family member who could recognize Dad's genius, but was that actually true? Could I really understand the technical complexity of his inventions, or was I just better at recognizing that my initial assumptions had been wrong? I don't know, I admitted. I understand enough to see that his solutions are elegant and his documentation is thorough. I can follow the logic of his design trees and appreciate the foresight required to identify the problems he was solving. But I'm probably not qualified to evaluate whether his technical approaches are truly innovative or just competently executed. Then what makes you think you deserve to inherit his business? The question hit like a physical blow. Pat wasn't being cruel. She was asking the same thing Michael and Jennifer were probably wondering. If none of us were technically qualified to appreciate Dad's work at a professional level, what made my curiosity more valuable than their skepticism? Maybe it's not about deserving, I said finally. Maybe it's about being willing to learn. Dad's test wasn't whether we already understood his work. It was whether we could recognize its value when presented with evidence of its success. Whether we could admit we'd been wrong and adjust our understanding accordingly. And you think Michael and Jennifer can't do that? I think they're struggling with it. I think the idea that they spent years condescending to someone who was actually more successful than any of them is hard to accept. It's easier to focus on feeling manipulated by Dad's will than to grapple with the implications of being fundamentally wrong about his capabilities. Pat was quiet for so long I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I threw away some of his prototypes last month, she said. When I was spring cleaning, I found a box of what looked like broken electronics in the closet and put it out with the trash. I thought I was just cleaning up clutter, but now I'm wondering what I might have destroyed. The confession hung between us like a physical weight. How many iterations of Dad's inventions had been lost over the years to well-meaning family members who couldn't distinguish between garbage and valuable research materials? How many breakthrough moments had gone unrecognized because we'd trained ourselves not to take his work seriously? We can't change what we didn't understand then, I said, but we can decide how to handle what we understand now. What are you going to do? Pat asked. About the business, about the inheritance, about Michael and Jennifer. I'd been avoiding that question all day, but it was becoming unavoidable. Dad had left me with more than just money and patents. He'd left me with the responsibility of deciding whether his work would continue to matter after his death. Whether his inventions would keep helping people, or whether they'd be abandoned by family members who still couldn't see their value. I'm going to honor what Dad built, I said. I'm going to learn everything I can about his inventions and his business practices. I'm going to make sure his patents stay active and his licensing agreements get renewed. And I'm going to try to expand his work in ways that would make him proud, even if it means cutting out Michael and Jennifer. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope they can find a way to appreciate what Dad accomplished and want to be part of preserving his legacy. But if they can't, if they're more interested in fighting the terms of his will than understanding the value of his work, then yes. I'll honor Dad's wishes and move forward without them. After hanging up with Pat, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by Dad's patents and business documents, trying to fully comprehend what I'd inherited. Not just money, though $400,000 was more than I'd ever imagined having. Not just ongoing royalty income, though $60,000 a year would fundamentally change my financial security. But responsibility for preserving and expanding work that was genuinely helping people around the world. Dad's water filtration system was being used in refugee camps, where clean water meant the difference between health and disease. His emergency communication devices were helping disaster response teams coordinate rescue efforts when traditional infrastructure failed. His solar efficiency improvements were making renewable energy viable in communities that had never had reliable electricity. This wasn't just a business, it was a legacy of innovation that could continue making a difference long after Dad was gone. But only if someone took responsibility for maintaining and expanding his work. The question was whether I was capable of being that someone. Part 7. The pattern of deception. The next morning brought a call from Amanda Torres, the attorney Dad had worked with to set up his estate planning. She'd received copies of all the documents I'd found in the safety deposit box and wanted to discuss the legal implications of Dad's dual will situation. "Your father was quite thorough," she said when I arrived at her office downtown. "The trust he established for his business assets is ironclad, and the conditions for inheritance are clearly defined. But I suspect the bigger challenge will be proving that your siblings meet or fail to meet those conditions." "What do you mean?" "The will states that heirs must demonstrate understanding and respect for the work that created these assets. That's subjective language, open to interpretation. Michael and Jennifer could argue that they do understand and respect your father's work, even if they initially called it junk. How do we objectively measure their appreciation?" I'd been so focused on the revelation of Dad's success that I hadn't considered the practical difficulties of implementing his wishes. How could anyone prove that Michael and Jennifer were incapable of appreciating Dad's work? How could I demonstrate that my own appreciation was genuine, rather than strategic? "Dad kept detailed records," I said. "His journal documents years of attempts to share his work with family members and their responses. There's a clear pattern of dismissal and condescension. Past behavior isn't necessarily indicative of current capacity for growth," Amanda pointed out. "People can change their minds when presented with new information. If Michael and Jennifer now claim to understand the value of your father's inventions, how do we prove they're being insincere?" It was a good question, and one that made me realize how carefully Dad must have thought through his inheritance conditions. He couldn't simply disinherit Michael and Jennifer outright. That would have been vulnerable to legal challenge and inconsistent with his genuine hope that they might surprise him. But he could create conditions that would reveal whether they were capable of the kind of intellectual humility required to appreciate work they'd previously dismissed. "What if we made it practical rather than theoretical?" I suggested. "Instead of asking them to demonstrate appreciation in the abstract, what if they had to show they could actually engage with Dad's work in meaningful ways? Such as learning enough about his inventions to explain how they function and why they're valuable. Such as understanding his business model well enough to make informed decisions about licensing and development. Such as recognizing the technical sophistication of his solutions instead of just accepting that other people found them valuable." Amanda nodded slowly. "That's more objective. We could establish specific benchmarks for technical understanding and business comprehension. If your siblings can meet those benchmarks, they demonstrate genuine appreciation. If they can't or won't try, they demonstrate that their claims of respect are superficial. How would we test that?" "We could require them to complete a comprehensive evaluation process. Technical interviews about your father's inventions, business plan development for expanding his work, demonstration of ability to engage with licensing partners and patent attorneys. Think of it as proving they're qualified to inherit a technology business, rather than just proving they've changed their minds about calling it junk." The idea appealed to me because it moved beyond the emotional dynamics that had defined our family's response to Dad's work. Instead of arguing about who had been more supportive or understanding in the past, we'd be focusing on who was capable of carrying his legacy forward effectively in the future. But it also made me realize that I'd have to meet the same standards. If Michael and Jennifer needed to prove their technical and business competence, so did I. The fact that Dad had trusted me with his secrets didn't automatically qualify me to manage his inventions or expand his business operations. "I should probably take the same evaluation," I said. "If I'm going to inherit responsibility for Dad's work, I should prove I'm actually capable of handling that responsibility." "That's admirable," Amanda said, "but legally unnecessary." Your father's will gives you primary inheritance rights based on his assessment of your character and potential, not your current qualifications. He believed you had the capacity to learn what you needed to know. But what if he was wrong? What if I'm no more qualified than Michael and Jennifer to understand his technical work or manage his business relationships? Then you'll learn, or you'll find qualified people to help you learn. The difference isn't your starting level of expertise, it's your willingness to acknowledge what you don't know and work to address those gaps. Amanda's observation reminded me of something I'd noticed while reading Dad's journal entries. He'd never portrayed himself as naturally gifted or immediately successful. Instead, he documented years of careful study, methodical experimentation, and gradual improvement. His success had come from persistence and intellectual curiosity, not from innate genius that others lacked. Maybe that's what he'd seen in my questions about his projects, not superior intelligence, but willingness to admit ignorance and seek understanding. Michael and Jennifer had stopped asking questions because they'd assumed Dad's work wasn't worth understanding. I'd kept asking questions because I'd assumed my understanding was incomplete. There's something else we need to discuss, Amanda said, shifting to a different folder on her desk. Your father's business has ongoing obligations that require immediate attention. Licensing agreements that need renewal, patent maintenance fees that are due, consulting relationships that require communication about his death and succession planning. The reality of inheriting an active business hit me like cold water. This wasn't just about deciding whether Michael and Jennifer deserved a share of Dad's accumulated wealth. It was about taking responsibility for ongoing operations that affected other people's businesses and livelihoods. How much time do I have to get up to speed? Some things are immediate. The licensing agreement with Humanitarian Technologies expires next month, and they need to know whether it will be renewed and who they'll be working with going forward. The patent maintenance fees for the solar efficiency device are due in 6 weeks. The consulting contract with Global Emergency Communications requires quarterly progress reports, and the next one is overdue. I felt suddenly overwhelmed by the scope of what Dad had been managing while maintaining the facade of simple retirement. He'd been juggling multiple complex business relationships, while his family assumed he spent his days fixing broken radios and building birdhouses. Did he have help with any of this? Business partners, professional advisors, administrative support. He worked with several patent attorneys over the years, and he had accounting help for tax preparation. But the day-to-day business operations were handled entirely by your father. He was remarkably organized and thorough, but everything depended on his personal attention and expertise. Which meant that if I couldn't quickly develop the skills necessary to manage Dad's business relationships, his legacy would crumble regardless of family inheritance disputes. The patents would lapse, the licensing agreements would expire, and the innovations that were helping people around the world would disappear because no one in his family was qualified to maintain them. I need to understand everything, I said. Not just the technical details of his inventions, but the business relationships, the legal requirements, the ongoing commitments. How do I do that without disrupting operations or disappointing his partners? You start by being honest about your situation, Amanda advised. Contact his business partners, explain that you're inheriting responsibility for his work, but need time to learn the details. Most people will appreciate transparency and be willing to provide guidance during the transition period. And if they're not, if they decide his business relationships died with him, then you'll learn quickly whether you have the determination and capability your father believed you had. Managing a technology business isn't just about understanding the technical details, it's about building relationships, solving problems, and adapting to challenges. Skills that can be learned by someone with the right attitude and work ethic. After leaving Amanda's office, I drove to Dad's house to begin what felt like an archaeological expedition through his business records. Pat had given me access to his workshop and personal office, and I needed to understand the full scope of his operations before making any commitments to continue his work. The office revealed another layer of Dad's secret life. Filing cabinets filled with correspondence from licensing partners, technical drawings for product improvements, market research on applications for his inventions in developing countries. A computer system with software for patent research, engineering simulation, and business financial management. A phone with multiple voicemail messages from business contacts who didn't yet know about his death. But it was the wall calendar that really drove home the complexity of what Dad had been managing. Entries for patent filing deadlines, licensing agreement review meetings, consulting project milestones, technical conference calls with partners in 3 different countries. A full professional schedule, hidden behind the appearance of leisurely retirement. I spent the afternoon trying to piece together Dad's business ecosystem. The water filtration patents were licensed to Humanitarian Technologies for use in refugee camps and disaster relief operations. The solar efficiency improvements were being manufactured by 2 different companies for residential and commercial applications. The emergency communication devices were still in development with Global Emergency Communications, with plans for deployment by international aid organizations. Each relationship represented not just income for Dad's business, but real-world applications that were helping people access clean water, reliable energy, and emergency communication services. If these partnerships collapsed due to poor succession planning, the impact would extend far beyond our family's financial situation. But understanding the business relationships also revealed something else. Dad had been more than just an inventor. He'd been actively involved in refining his designs, based on user feedback, developing new applications for his core technologies, and identifying emerging market needs that his innovations could address. This wasn't passive income from old patents, it was an active business requiring ongoing technical and strategic leadership. Which raised the crucial question Amanda had been too polite to ask directly. Was I actually capable of providing that leadership, or would I destroy Dad's legacy through incompetence despite my good intentions? The answer would determine not just my own future, but the future of innovations that were genuinely making a difference in the world. Part 8. The investigation begins. I started with Dad's most important business relationship, Humanitarian Technologies, the company that licensed his water filtration patents for disaster relief operations. According to the contract renewal notice I'd found in his files, they needed confirmation of continued partnership by the end of the month, less than 2 weeks away. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Humanitarian Technologies Technical Director, answered on the second ring. Her voice carried the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations, but it softened when I explained who I was and why I was calling. Robert's daughter, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was remarkable, one of the most innovative engineers I've worked with in 20 years of disaster relief technology development. Engineer, the word hit me with unexpected force. Dr. Rodriguez didn't qualify her assessment or hedge her praise. To her, Dad was simply an engineer, whose work met professional standards and solved real problems. I'm calling because I've inherited responsibility for Dad's business operations, I said, but I need to understand exactly what he was providing to your organization before I can commit to continuing the partnership. Robert was developing the next generation of portable water filtration systems for us, units that could process contaminated water from any source, and produce drinking water that meets WHO standards for emergency situations. But more than that, he was helping us customize the technology for specific deployment scenarios. Customize how? Well, refugee camps have different requirements than earthquake disaster zones, which have different requirements than hurricane evacuation centers. Robert's designs were modular, so we could configure them for different water sources, different volumes, different power availability. He understood that disaster relief technology needs to be adaptable rather than one size fits all. As Dr. Rodriguez described Dad's work, I began to understand the sophistication I'd been missing. This wasn't just about building a device that cleaned water, it was about understanding the complex logistical and technical challenges of providing clean water in chaotic, resource-limited environments. Dad had been thinking like a systems engineer, not just an inventor. The partnership has been incredibly successful, Dr. Rodriguez continued. We've deployed Robert's filtration systems in refugee camps in 3 different countries, and they've processed over 2 million gallons of contaminated water into safe drinking water. We've documented significant reductions in waterborne illness in communities where his systems are operational. 2 million gallons. The number staggered me. While we'd been dismissing Dad's work as hobby-level tinkering, his inventions had been providing clean water to thousands of people in crisis situations. His junk had been saving lives. Dr. Rodriguez, can I ask you something directly? When you first met Dad, did you have any concerns about working with someone who didn't have formal engineering credentials? She laughed. Credentials. I have a PhD in environmental engineering from MIT, and Robert consistently proposed solutions I hadn't considered. He had an intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics and materials science that most formally trained engineers would envy. Honestly, I was more worried about whether we could afford his consulting rates than whether his work would meet our standards. His consulting rates. Robert charged premium prices because his work was genuinely innovative. Most water filtration technology requires expensive components or complex maintenance procedures. Robert's designs used common materials assembled in ways that maximized efficiency while minimizing cost and complexity. That's the holy grail of disaster relief technology, solutions that work perfectly but can be manufactured, deployed, and maintained anywhere in the world. After hanging up with Dr. Rodriguez, I sat in Dad's office trying to process what I'd learned. The family had seen him as a retiree playing with electronics, but his professional partners saw him as a premium consultant whose innovative solutions commanded high fees. The disconnect wasn't just about technical understanding, it was about recognizing expertise when it didn't come wrapped in conventional credentials. My next call was to Frank Peterson, Dad's oldest friend, and the person listed as emergency contact for several business relationships. Frank had worked with Dad at the hardware store for 15 years before they both retired, and I'd always assumed he shared our family's view of Dad's projects as harmless hobbies. "Sarah, I'm so glad you called," Frank said, when I explained the situation. "I've been wondering what would happen to Bob's work. He talked about you all the time, you know. Said you were the only one in the family who understood what he was really building." "Frank, did you know about Dad's patents and licensing agreements?" "Know about them. Hell, I helped him with some of the early testing. Bob used to bring prototypes to my garage when he needed a second opinion or wanted to run stress tests in a different environment. I may not have engineering training, but I've been fixing machinery for 50 years. I know quality work when I see it. Why didn't anyone else in the family know?" Frank was quiet for a moment, because Bob tried to tell them, and they didn't listen. "Not really. They heard him talking about his projects, but they filtered everything through their assumptions about what a guy like Bob could accomplish. Eventually he stopped trying to explain and just focused on doing the work." "But you listened." "I listened because I'd seen Bob solve problems at the hardware store that stumped customers with engineering degrees. I'd watched him troubleshoot equipment failures that left trained technicians scratching their heads. I knew he was smart, so when he said he was working on something important, I took him seriously." Frank's perspective offered a different angle on Dad's isolation. It wasn't that everyone dismissed his intelligence, it was that the people closest to him had made assumptions about his limitations that prevented them from recognizing his capabilities. Frank, who'd worked alongside Dad for years, had developed respect for his problem-solving abilities that family members had never bothered to cultivate. "Frank, I need to ask you something important. Do you think I'm capable of continuing Dad's work, or should I find someone else to take over his business operations?" "That depends," Frank said. "Are you asking because you want to honor Bob's legacy, or because you think you should want to honor?" The distinction hit me harder than I'd expected. Was I genuinely interested in understanding and expanding Dad's work, or was I just trying to live up to the trust he'd placed in me? Did I have real passion for innovation and problem solving, or was I motivated primarily by guilt about not appreciating his achievements while he was alive? "I don't know," I admitted. "I think I want to honor his legacy, but I'm not sure I understand what that really means, or whether I'm equipped to do it effectively." "Then start with the wanting," Frank advised. Bob didn't become a successful
Inventor overnight. He spent years learning, experimenting, failing, and improving. What made him special wasn't natural genius. It was persistence and curiosity. If you've got those qualities, you can learn the rest. And if I don't, if I discover that I'm just not cut out for this kind of work, then you'll figure out how to connect Bob's innovations with people who are cut out for it. The worst thing you could do is let his work disappear because you're afraid of not being perfect at continuing it. After talking with Frank, I called Global Emergency Communications to discuss Dad's consulting contract with them. The conversation with their engineering manager, Dr. James Walsh, reinforced what I was learning about Dad's professional reputation. Robert was developing communication protocols that could maintain network connectivity in environments where traditional infrastructure was compromised, Dr. Walsh explained. Hurricane zones, earthquake areas, conflict regions, anywhere normal communication systems might fail. His devices created mesh networks using whatever power sources and signal boosters were available locally. How close was he to completing that work? Very close. We were planning to begin field testing next quarter with full deployment scheduled for next year. But the project requires ongoing technical leadership through the testing phase. Someone needs to analyze performance data,
troubleshoot problems, and refine the protocols based on real-world conditions. Could I learn to do that work, or would you need to find a different technical partner? Dr. Walsh paused. I'd need to assess your technical background and aptitude. But Robert always said innovation was more about asking the right questions than knowing the right answers. If you can learn to ask the questions he was asking, we might be able to work together. The conversation left me both encouraged and daunted. Dad's business partners were willing to work with me, but only if I could demonstrate genuine capability to contribute to their projects. It wasn't enough to inherit his legacy. I'd have to earn the right to continue it. That evening, I called Michael and Jennifer to update them on what I'd learned about Dad's business relationships. Michael's response was predictably focused on the financial implications. So these companies were paying Dad significant consulting fees for ongoing work, he asked. Work that requires continued technical input to maintain the income stream, that's right. This isn't just passive royalty income, it's an active business that requires ongoing engineering and business development. And you think you're qualified to provide that kind of technical leadership? The skepticism in his voice reminded me that Michael still couldn't quite believe Dad had been operating at a professional level. If he couldn't accept Dad's capabilities, he certainly wouldn't accept mine. I think I'm qualified to learn, I said. The question is whether you and Jennifer are interested in learning too, or whether you're more focused on challenging the inheritance conditions. I'm focused on understanding why Dad felt the need to create this elaborate test instead of just being honest about his success while he was alive. Even if his work was legitimately valuable, even if we were wrong to dismiss it, punishing us for that misunderstanding seems vindictive. Maybe it's not about punishment, I suggested. Maybe it's about protecting valuable work from people who can't appreciate its worth. Dad spent 25 years building something important, and he wanted to make sure it would be preserved and expanded by people who understood its significance. And you think we're incapable of understanding its significance? I think you're struggling to move past feeling manipulated by Dad's will conditions to focus on whether his work actually deserves preservation and expansion. The question isn't whether he should have told us about his success sooner. The question is whether we can learn to appreciate innovation when we see it. Michael was quiet for a long moment. What would that look like practically? This appreciation you think we need to develop. Start by learning how his inventions work. Understand the problems they solve and why his solutions are superior to existing alternatives. Talk to his business partners and hear how his work has impacted their operations. Stop seeing his projects as amateur electronics and start seeing them as professional engineering solutions. And if we do that, if we demonstrate this appreciation you're talking about, then what? We become equal partners in inheriting his business? Then we become qualified to make decisions about how to preserve and expand his legacy. Whether that means equal partnership or some other arrangement would depend on our respective levels of interest and capability. After hanging up with Michael, I realized that Dad's test was more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. It wasn't just about measuring appreciation, it was about developing the capability to be good stewards of his legacy. The inheritance conditions weren't arbitrary, they were designed to ensure that whoever inherited his work would be prepared to handle the responsibility effectively. But they were also designed to reveal something about character. Would Michael and Jennifer be motivated by genuine interest in Dad's innovations, or primarily by desire to claim their share of his financial success? Would they be willing to invest the time and effort required to understand his work, or would they expect to inherit the benefits without accepting the responsibilities? The answers to those questions would determine not just the distribution of Dad's estate, but the future of innovations that were helping people around the world access clean water, reliable energy, and emergency communication services. Part 9, Uncovering the Legal Fraud. 2 weeks into my crash course in Dad's business operations, I discovered something that made his secrecy look less like paranoia, and more like necessity. While reviewing his correspondence files, I found a folder labeled Patent Challenges that contained documentation of 3 separate attempts by competitors to invalidate his core patents. The most recent challenge had been filed just 6 months before Dad's death by a company called Advanced Water Solutions, claiming that Dad's filtration designs were based on prior art and therefore unpatentable. The legal documents revealed a sustained campaign to discredit not just Dad's technical work, but his credibility as an inventor. Mr. Mitchell lacks formal engineering credentials and professional experience in water treatment technology, read one filing. His patent applications demonstrate amateur understanding of established filtration principles and should not have been approved by the Patent Office. The language was precisely calculated to exploit the same assumptions my family had made about Dad's capabilities. Without a degree or corporate affiliation, how could he possibly be developing innovative solutions that surpassed work by formally trained engineers? The patent challenge documents revealed something that changed my understanding of everything. Advanced Water Solutions wasn't just a competitor trying to invalidate Dad's patents, they were a subsidiary of Clearwater Industries, the same company that had been aggressively acquiring water treatment patents across the industry. Their challenge wasn't about prior art or patent validity. It was about eliminating competition from an independent inventor, whose innovations were disrupting their market dominance. I found the smoking gun in a document that had been accidentally included in the discovery materials Dad's attorney had received. An internal email from Clearwater's vice president of strategic acquisitions discussing their Mitchell problem. The independent inventor continues to undercut our pricing with superior technology, the email read. His filtration systems require 60% fewer replacement components and operate efficiently in conditions where our units fail. Refugee camp contracts are increasingly specifying Mitchell-type filtration as the standard. We need to either acquire his patents or eliminate their commercial viability. Dad hadn't just been defending his patents against routine challenges. He'd been fighting a coordinated campaign by a major corporation to destroy his business because his innovations were too successful. They couldn't compete with his technology, so they'd tried to eliminate it through legal warfare. But there was more. The correspondence files contained documentation of multiple acquisition offers Clearwater had made over the years, starting with what appeared to be legitimate partnership proposals and escalating to increasingly aggressive buyout attempts. The final offer, made just 8 months before Dad's death, was accompanied by barely veiled threats about the costs of continued patent litigation. Mr. Mitchell should consider the substantial financial burden of defending multiple patent challenges simultaneously, the letter read. Clearwater Industries has extensive legal resources and is prepared to pursue every available avenue to protect our intellectual property interests. Independent inventors often find extended litigation financially unsustainable. The subtext was clear: sell us your patents or we'll bankrupt you with legal fees. Dad had chosen to fight rather than surrender his life's work to corporate bullies, but the stress of that fight had been enormous. His journal entries from the final year of his life revealed the toll the patent battles had taken. Another motion filed by Clearwater's attorneys today read one entry from 4 months before his death. They're claiming my emergency communication protocols infringe on patents they acquired from a company that went out of business in 2019. The legal fees are eating into the business profits, but I can't let them steal work that took 15 years to develop. These devices are helping people. I won't let some corporate lawyers turn them into products that only wealthy countries can afford. Reading Dad's private thoughts about the patent battles, I understood why he'd been so secretive about his success. He hadn't just been protecting his work from family members who couldn't appreciate its value, he'd been protecting it from competitors who wanted to steal or destroy it. Corporate espionage wasn't limited to high-tech companies in Silicon Valley. It extended to any innovation that threatened established market players, even inventions developed by a retiree working in his garage workshop. But Dad's defensive strategy had been more sophisticated than I'd realized. Working with his patent attorney, he'd been preparing for the possibility that Clearwater might escalate their campaign beyond legal challenges. The safety deposit box contained not just business documents but evidence of every interaction with Clearwater, every threat they'd made, every questionable legal tactic they'd employed. If something happens to me, Dad had written in a sealed letter I found with his attorney's business card attached, make sure Sarah understands that Clearwater Industries will try to acquire my patents through the estate settlement process. They'll offer substantial money, but accepting their offer means abandoning everyone who depends on affordable access to clean water and emergency communication technology. The letter continued with specific instructions for maintaining the licensing agreements that made Dad's innovations available to humanitarian organizations at cost. Clearwater's business model involved charging premium prices for proprietary technology that required expensive maintenance contracts. Dad's business model involved licensing his innovations broadly to maximize their positive impact, even when that meant accepting lower profit margins. The patents are worth more than money, the letter concluded. They represent solutions to problems that affect millions of people. Don't let corporate greed turn life-saving technology into luxury products. Reading Dad's final instructions, I realized that inheriting his business meant accepting responsibility for more than just financial assets. It meant becoming the guardian of innovations that were helping people in crisis situations access basic necessities like clean water and reliable communication. It meant continuing Dad's fight against corporate interests that prioritized profit over human welfare. But it also meant understanding why he'd been so careful about who would inherit that responsibility. Michael and Jennifer's focus on the financial value of Dad's estate made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of acquisition offers Clearwater would likely make. If they couldn't appreciate the humanitarian impact of Dad's work, they might see selling to the highest bidder as a rational business decision. That evening, I called Dr. Rodriguez at Humanitarian Technologies to ask about Clearwater's impact on disaster relief operations. Clearwater, they're a nightmare for organizations like ours, she said immediately. Their equipment works well enough, but their pricing model makes it accessible only to well-funded operations. We've seen refugee camps go without adequate water filtration because they couldn't afford Clearwater's licensing fees and maintenance contracts. What made Dad's approach different? Robert understood that humanitarian technology needs to be sustainable and affordable, not just functional. His designs used common components that could be sourced locally, and his licensing terms allowed us to manufacture units at cost rather than paying premium royalties. But more than that, he was committed to continuous improvement based on field feedback. When we identified problems or needed modifications for specific deployment scenarios, Robert worked with us to develop solutions rather than trying to sell us expensive add-on products. Have you had any contact with Clearwater about acquiring Dad's patents? Not directly, but we've heard rumors that they're planning to make aggressive acquisition offers to his estate. If they succeed, it would be devastating for humanitarian water treatment operations globally. Clearwater's technology requires specialized maintenance that's impossible in remote locations, and their pricing structure would make clean water a luxury rather than a basic necessity. The conversation reinforced my growing understanding of what was really at stake in Dad's inheritance conditions. This wasn't just about family dynamics or financial assets, it was about whether innovations designed to help people would continue serving that purpose or be transformed into profit-maximizing products that served only wealthy customers. But I also realized that I needed to understand more about Clearwater's acquisition strategy. If they were planning to approach Dad's estate with buyout offers, I needed to be prepared with counter-arguments that went beyond emotional appeals about preserving Dad's humanitarian legacy. The next morning, I called Dad's patent attorney, David Chen, to discuss Clearwater's likely next moves. They'll wait until the estate is settled, then approach whoever inherits the patents with what appears to be a generous offer. David predicted. They'll emphasize the ongoing costs of patent maintenance, the complexity of managing licensing relationships, and the risks of continued litigation. For heirs who don't understand the business, their offer will look like an easy solution to complicated responsibilities. How generous are we talking? Probably $2 to $3 million for the complete patent portfolio and existing licensing agreements. Enough to seem like life-changing money, especially to people who don't realize the long-term value of what they'd be selling. $2 to $3 million. The number was staggering, and I could imagine how Michael and Jennifer would react to an offer of that magnitude. They'd probably see it as vindication that Dad's work was genuinely valuable, and as an opportunity to benefit from his success without accepting the responsibilities of managing his business operations. What would happen to the humanitarian applications if Clearwater acquired the patents? They'd restructure the licensing agreements to maximize profitability, David said. Humanitarian organizations would face dramatically higher costs, maintenance requirements would become more complex and expensive, and new applications would be developed primarily for commercial rather than humanitarian markets. Could we fight an acquisition attempt legally? If you inherit the patents, you have complete control over whether to sell them. But if Michael and Jennifer inherit equal shares, they could potentially outvote you in favor of accepting Clearwater's offer. That's why your father's inheritance conditions are so important. They ensure that whoever controls his patents will understand their significance beyond financial value. After hanging up with David, I realized that Dad's will wasn't just about family dynamics, it was about corporate warfare. He'd been fighting Clearwater for years, and he'd designed his estate planning to ensure that fight would continue after his death, but only if his heirs proved capable of understanding what they were fighting for. The question was whether Michael and Jennifer could develop that understanding, or whether Clearwater's acquisition strategy would exploit their focus on immediate financial benefit over long-term humanitarian impact. Part 11. The strategic planning. Armed with a deeper understanding of what I'd inherited, I began developing a comprehensive plan for preserving and expanding Dad's legacy while protecting it from corporate acquisition attempts. But first I needed to test whether Michael and Jennifer were genuinely interested in learning about Dad's work or primarily motivated by the financial opportunities it represented. I called a family meeting at Dad's house, with Amanda Torres attending to explain the legal framework for implementing his inheritance conditions. Pat had agreed to let us use the workshop as a demonstration space, and I'd spent the previous day organizing Dad's prototypes and technical documentation into a coherent presentation. Michael and Jennifer arrived with the wary expressions of people expecting to be tested, which was exactly what was about to happen. But instead of making them feel defensive, I wanted to help them understand why Dad's work mattered beyond its monetary value. Before we discuss inheritance terms, I want to show you what Dad actually accomplished, not just how much money he made doing it. I started with the water filtration system, explaining the technical challenges of creating portable units that could handle contaminated water from any source, while remaining simple enough for deployment in crisis situations. Using Dad's prototypes and technical drawings, I demonstrated how his modular design solved problems that had stumped formally trained engineers for decades. The key innovation isn't any single component, I explained, channeling explanations I'd heard Dad give years earlier. It's the way he integrated multiple filtration stages to maximize efficiency while minimizing maintenance requirements. Look at this flow control mechanism. It automatically adjusts processing speed based on contamination levels, so the system works optimally whether it's filtering muddy river water or chemically polluted groundwater. Jennifer leaned forward to examine the device more closely. How does it know what kind of contamination it's dealing with? That's the brilliant part. Instead of using expensive sensors, Dad designed a mechanical system that responds to fluid dynamics. Different types of contamination create different flow patterns, and the system uses those patterns to optimize its filtering approach. For the first time since Dad's funeral, Jennifer was asking genuine technical questions rather than making assumptions about the sophistication of his work. Michael remained skeptical, but I could see him paying attention to the details in ways he'd never done before. I moved on to the emergency communication devices, explaining how Dad had solved the problem of maintaining network connectivity when traditional infrastructure failed. His mesh network protocols allowed devices to automatically find and connect with any available signal sources, creating redundant communication pathways that became more robust as more devices came online. During the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico in 2019, I said, referencing information I'd found in Dad's correspondence files, emergency response teams used Dad's communication devices to coordinate rescue operations when cell towers were down and power grids had failed. The devices created a communication network using car batteries, solar panels, and handheld radios that allowed rescue teams to find survivors and coordinate medical evacuations. Dad's devices were used in Puerto Rico. Jennifer asked, her voice carrying a note of awe. He never mentioned that. He tried to tell us about his work for years, I said gently. We just weren't listening in the right way. Pat had been quiet during the technical demonstration, but now she spoke up. Bob used to get so excited when he received feedback from people using his inventions. He'd get emails from relief workers describing how his devices performed in field conditions, and he'd spend hours in his workshop making improvements based on their suggestions. I thought he was just playing. I never understood that real people were depending on his work. Amanda Torres had been taking notes during the demonstration, and now she addressed Michael and Jennifer directly. Based on what Sarah has shown you, do you believe your father's inventions represent sophisticated engineering solutions to important problems? Michael looked uncomfortable with the directness of the question. I can see that they work, and I can see that people find them valuable. But I still don't understand why Dad felt the need to test our appreciation, rather than just explaining the significance of his work while he was alive. Perhaps because explanation requires receptive listeners, Amanda suggested. Your father documented multiple attempts to share his work with family members over the years. The question is whether you're now prepared to be the kind of listeners he needed you to be. What does that mean practically? Jennifer asked. It means proving you can understand his work well enough to make informed decisions about its future, I said. Not just accepting that it's valuable because other people say so, but developing enough technical and business knowledge to be effective stewards of his legacy. I outlined the evaluation process Amanda and I had developed. Technical interviews to demonstrate understanding of how Dad's inventions worked and why they were superior to existing alternatives. Business planning exercises to show comprehension of his licensing strategies and humanitarian commitments. Meetings with his business partners to prove capability to maintain and expand his professional relationships. This isn't about proving you're engineers, I clarified. It's about proving you can learn enough to make responsible decisions about innovations that affect people's access to clean water and emergency communication services. Michael's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching anger. So we have to pass your tests to inherit what's rightfully ours anyway. You have to pass Dad's tests, I corrected. Tests he designed to ensure his life's work would be preserved and expanded by people who understood its significance. And if we refuse to take your tests, if we challenge the inheritance conditions legally? Amanda Torres answered that question. Your father anticipated that possibility. The will includes provisions for extended litigation, with the estate's assets being managed by independent trustees until the inheritance conditions are resolved. Given the complexity of the business relationships and ongoing patent challenges, that process could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Meaning we'd spend more fighting the will than we'd inherit even if we won, Jennifer said. Meaning your father was determined to protect his legacy from people who couldn't appreciate its value, even members of his own family, Amanda replied. The room fell silent as Michael and Jennifer absorbed the implications of Dad's legal maneuvering. He hadn't just created tests for them to pass, he'd made it financially devastating to refuse taking those tests. They could spend years fighting his inheritance conditions and end up with nothing, or they could invest a few months learning about his work and potentially inherit substantial assets. But there was a third option that I suspected they were both considering: accepting Clearwater's acquisition offer and walking away with millions of dollars without having to learn anything about Dad's technical work or business operations. There's something else you need to understand, I said, pulling out the Clearwater correspondence files. Dad's business has been under attack by competitors who want to acquire or destroy his innovations. If we inherit his patents, we'll be inheriting his fight against corporate interests that prioritize profit over humanitarian impact. I explained Clearwater's acquisition strategy, their patent challenges, and their likely approach to Dad's estate. Michael and Jennifer listened with growing alarm, as they realized that inheriting Dad's business meant accepting responsibility for defending it against well-funded adversaries. So even if we pass Dad's tests and inherit his patents, Michael said, we'll be facing ongoing legal battles with companies that have unlimited legal budgets. We'll be continuing Dad's work of protecting innovations that help people from corporations that want to exploit them, I corrected. The legal battles are just one aspect of preserving something valuable. Or we could just sell everything to Clearwater and avoid the complications, Jennifer said quietly. Which is exactly what they're counting on, I replied. They know that most people would rather accept a large immediate payment than deal with the complexities of managing a technology business. But selling to Clearwater means abandoning everyone who depends on affordable access to Dad's innovations. Pat had been reading through Dad's journal during our discussion, and now she looked up with tears in her eyes. Listen to this entry from last Christmas, she said, and began reading aloud. Received photos today from a refugee camp in Jordan, where my water filtration systems are providing clean drinking water for 3,000 people. Children who might have died from waterborne diseases are healthy because of devices I built in my workshop. But I can't share this pride with my family, because they see my work as worthless tinkering. Sometimes I wonder if the strangers who benefit from my inventions understand their value better than the people who live in my house. The entry hit the room like a physical blow. Dad hadn't been keeping his success secret out of paranoia or spite. He'd been protecting something precious from people who couldn't recognize its worth. His secrecy had been an act of preservation, not manipulation. The question isn't whether Dad should have told us about his success sooner, I said finally. The question is whether we're capable of appreciating innovation when we see it, and whether we're willing to accept responsibility for preserving work that genuinely helps people. Michael and Jennifer sat in Dad's workshop, surrounded by prototypes and technical documentation that represented 25 years of careful innovation, trying to decide whether they wanted to understand what their father had really accomplished, or whether they preferred the simplicity of seeing his legacy as a financial asset to be liquidated. The choice they made would determine not just their own inheritance, but the future of technologies that were helping people around the world access basic necessities in crisis situations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.